We also have a fully voiced cast of NPCs.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is a very interesting opportunity to maybe get some Critical Role folks involved. Maybe you'll be hearing them as a character in a future...
Oh, did they do VO as well?
Maybe do some voices here and there.
Welcome to the Character Sheet, comic books home for everything TTRPG and fantasy news. And today we have some very special guests with us. We have two of the fine folks from Tales of the Stinky Dragon.
Woo!
Very
Hello.
good actual play podcast that has recently joined the Critical Role / Beacon publishing platform empire. And so we're here to talk with Micah and Barbara from the show. So guys, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. And let's start off with the big one, and that is for people that have somehow not come across Tales of the Stinky Dragon. Give us sort of the elevator pitch of like, what is Tales of the Stinky Dragon? What's the actual play about? What can they expect for a first-time listener?
Tales from the Stinky Dragon is a family-friendly radio-style drama, actual play D&D comedy podcast. That's it, right there.
All the things.
All of those like buzzwords right there. And we really strive to make it immersive, fun, improvisational, like for most of it, really. And it's got original music, it's got sound effects, it's got ambiance, it's got everything that you want and dream of in a D&D podcast, basically. So I don't know why you wouldn't have heard of it at this point, right?
No better elevator pitch.
And real quick, speaking of music, Micah, you do a lot of the composing on this, don't you?
I do. I don't know if you can see in the corner of my camera, There's actually a piano right there. Yeah, I have been playing music for a really long time in various styles and means, and it's been a dream of mine to actually score a project. And so this is kind of like the first big thing that I've actually gotten to score original orchestrated music for. And I don't get to do like the whole, like our show is typically like 90 minutes ish. And I don't do the 90 minutes of music. That would be week to week. That would be really, really hard. But I try to emphasize characters and places that they go to, and then use other people's music that's really good as well to kind of pad the rest.
No, and you can tell, if you haven't heard the podcast before, it has some, especially the last season in particular, has some very nice music to it. Nice piano arrangements.
Thank you.
It's a very smooth and very immersive listen. And now a lot of people probably have heard about you recently, given the news that Critical Role has brought on basically the distribution of Tales of the Stinky Dragon from Beacon. And so I just wanted to talk to you real quick. How did that come about? How did you guys get in touch with Critical Role? How did they get in touch with you? And sort of how did that all come to be?
Sure. Long story short, we've always kind of known a couple of the people within Critical Role. Before we were independent, we were part of Rooster Teeth Productions. And Rooster Teeth has had the pleasure of working with people like Travis and Laura from Critical Role. We have some, mutual connections between the team there. Rachel Romero, who's the head of marketing at Critical Role, also has worked with me before when she was at Machinima. And so we've kind of all circled in the same vicinity for a while. And then when we were independent, shortly after that, Critical Role reached out to us about potentially working together. We didn't know in what capacity at first. And then after talking for a while, we, made the arrangement to have our show be on the Beacon platform. They were going to license it and then potentially work together in other ways, TBD. Very excited to, explore those options with them. But obviously the Critical Role family is phenomenal. Critical Role is the D&D podcast. I think anybody who knows D&D, who's played D&D or has heard of D&D has heard of Critical Role. And so the fact that they were interested in us and our group and our show was very humbling, I think, for every single one of us, and also just such a pleasure to be part of the family now.
Yeah, it's very exciting. It's a ever expanding cast of or group of podcasts. We've talked to the Mitz crew a couple of times, and it's very fascinating to see Critical Role sort of build out this sort of independent but under one umbrella podcasting empire now, and it's very fun to see all the individual parts of that come together.
Empire is the right word. Yes.
Yes, it is. It's getting there. But speaking of those, we've seen Grog show up in the promotion of the new season as a puppet, and we've talked a little bit about it just then, but is there a chance that down the road that we will see, maybe some guest appearances from Critical Role cast, or is there stuff that you can't talk about down the line where there might be other different fun kinds of collaborations, like Grog the puppet showing up in other things, or other puppets, just kind of fun stuff like that going on down the road?
I think the possibilities are endless. I obviously know we've talked about multiple types of collaborations we could do together. Obviously, they sometimes have guests on some of the shows that they do. And then we also, as Micah mentioned, we have music and sound effects and sound design on the show, but we also have a fully voiced cast of NPCs.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is a very interesting opportunity to maybe get some Critical Role folks involved. Maybe you'll be hearing them as a character in a future.
Oh, did they do VO as well?
Maybe do some voices here and there. But yeah, I mean, we love working with them already. And so I think, the possibilities are endless.
Awesome. And now I get to ask a question that I only ever get to ask from like the Henson Company and first world governments intervening in third world countries, and now you guys, and that is, why the puppets?
Well, Micah, do you want to talk about the kind of history of the puppets and where they came from?
Yeah. So I have a mother, and my mother doesn't know how to stop. And she likes to craft things all the time. Every time I talk to her, which is pretty often, like she's like, "Hey, look what I made," and it's some new craft. And one day she was making these dolls, these puppets, out of the characters for our show, just because she wanted to be kind and friendly and generous and give these things to my friends. And so handed them off to them. And like I think Barbara or someone in our cast had the idea, like, what if we use these to actually like reenact moments in our podcast and post them, and it became this kind of way to showcase and advertise the show on like YouTube and socials and that sort of thing. And it just blew up. Like it just was a phenomenon that really helped people find our show and go into the podcast from there. And then we kind of made more shorts in that sense, and then eventually became something of a short form show that Barbara was a part of. I'll let Barbara actually talk about that.
Yeah, it's a show called Stinky Dragon Adventures, which was written by two of our cast members, Blaine Gibson and Chris Damaris. And it's an adaptation, actually, from our first campaign, the Infinite campaign, where we took the characters and a lot of the story beats and kind of overall world and adapted it into a short form puppet series. It's 8 episodes that are about 10 to 12 minutes each. And for that, it was completely puppeted. Everything was done practically, which was a very intense few months of shooting. A lot of sore arms from, lifting different puppet rods and stuff like that. But the whole reason it started in the first place was because, as you know, it's an audio-only podcast, and there's a huge challenge with trying to promote an audio-only product on social media or any other marketing platform. And so you almost need a visual component, which we don't really have. And so the puppets allowed us to take a clip from our show, which we know is very strong, and that if people hear it, they'll love it. And now they get to experience it in a bite-sized chunk with a very fun visual medium to it.
Yeah, if you at home have not watched them, like, go watch them. This is very much the puppet version of something like the Critical Role or Dimension 20 animatics, but with a very different take on it. But it also leads me to my next question, because they're also very funny. And that is, how do you find the balance between the humor and the sort of like profanity-free, family-friendly aspect of it? Because I know, as someone that's done some comedy writing before, like, I can, like, just talking now, I'm continuously having to talk myself into not saying like F-bombs everywhere. So how hard is it to keep that humor in there? Because it's a very funny show, and the humor is not aimed at like, it is humor for adults. So how hard is that process?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to the, player side of things, and I'll let Micah touch on the writing side of things. But, from our perspective, I think at first it was a little challenging because, being at Rooster Teeth, there's a lot of adult humor in a lot of our shows. Not a lot of things we made were for children or all ages. So I think like when we were just getting used to it, it was hard not to accidentally like pop a swear word in or something, just because that's what we're used to in the way we talk. But I think the more we went on, the more we found that it was almost more fun to keep it family friendly and to focus on just being funny in the moment rather than relying on, maybe more crude humor or sexual humor to make a joke and actually have to stretch our comedy skills in a different way. But I think we're very lucky in the sense that we've all been performing together for over a decade at this point within Rooster Teeth and in other projects. that we know each other and our humor very well, that we're able to kind of play into that a lot. And I feel like Stinky Dragon has just made us better at it and better at being just funny for all ages.
Yeah, I'd say like it's a work in progress. We didn't mean to do it at first, you know, like it was kind of fell into it. And we're like, hey, this actually kind of works for everybody. Let's make our audience just for anybody that wants to listen to this, rather than just people that are adults or who have even heard of D&D, you know. And so anybody can come into this show fresh and enjoy it with all kinds of people, you know, all kinds of kids or friends or whoever. And I think it's just fun to be able to introduce this kind of world, this nerdy world, to other people. And so, yeah, let's tell stories that everybody can enjoy and that are just wacky and crazy, and sometimes are suggestive, but we'll never cross that line.
Yeah. I think also us as a group, and I say this in a loving way, we're very dumb, like in a childish kind of like immature, goofy way, where I think that resonates with an audience of all ages. And we kind of play off of that, like doing a lot of silly things and kind of immature humor in that sense, that I think works for the style of podcast.
Oh, that's fantastic. And then you touched on briefly there about the aspect of the writing of the show, and like the continuous meme for Critical Role is like, oh, it's scripted. But in this show, I think there is some small element of scripting and of course a ton of improv. Like what exactly is that ratio, and like how does that change the way you go about doing a podcast?
Yeah, so I came onto the show as the writer, and eventually also became the editor, like audio editor, and doing sound effects and music, like I said. And I really just come up with a world for them. And of course, there are some times that I'll pre-write like NPC lines for Gus, our DM. So in that sense, that's scripted. Just so he has something to work with. It's not like everything is scripted in that sense, but as far as the players are concerned, they don't know anything that's going to happen in the show when it comes to the session. So it's very much an actual play, and sometimes Gus doesn't even know. So it's really up in the air a lot of times. And for the campaign 3, it's even more so, because I've tried to make it more sandboxy. And so the players can go anywhere they want. And I've tried to flesh out as much as I can with as many NPCs and locations and weird magic items that they can find. So I'd say, yeah, there's a lot of after the fact writing, some like rewriting lines that maybe Gus delivered, and we'll, you know, replace it with voiceover actors. And so in that sense, yeah, we have to give a script to someone, but yeah, it's very much an actual play.
Yeah, you're just taking the role of like Matt Mercer's Notebook, but if it was actually a person.
That's a great example.
But speaking of the world, let's talk a little bit about that world. How would you, before we dive specifically into campaign 3, how would you describe the world that Tales from the Stinky Dragon inhabits? Like, what's that world like?
Well, we had this idea that what if there was this tavern where people just tell stories like you would, and, you know, typical D&D campaign, you start in a tavern, that kind of thing. Well, what if the stories were told there, and we just kind of introduced the audience in that sense to each of these realms that these stories take place in. And so that's kind of what we do. We have a tavern intro at the beginning of introducing new drink, and then introducing kind of what happens at the beginning, and then we dive into this world. And so you have the first campaign, which is much more fantasy, wacky, weird, magical kind of things going on, in a very unassuming motley crew of interns that kind of find themselves in a situation they weren't expecting. And then the second campaign is a bit darker in the sense that it's kind of horror based, maybe like gothic horror, Victorian. There's a really mystery to the whole story, and kind of a detective work for the players as they are blamed for something that they like a crime they didn't commit. And then, yeah, for this third campaign, I wanted to go for something slightly different from even those first two, which is let's add some more of a big pantheon to this world, because I don't really touch into deities and gods in previous campaigns. And even more so, I wanted to throw them into a faction, which they haven't really done before. So I wanted them to be a part of like a military army that's trying to hold back these demons and devils from infiltrating where they shouldn't be. And so, yeah, I kind of like to hop around, mix genres and stuff. It's really fun.
Oh, that's awesome. And then so let's talk a little bit about campaign 3. I guess first, because you just kind of mentioned it, it's very much set in like kind of for D&D players, like something close to like the Blood Wars kind of a thing, where you've got this big sort of, you know, demonic forces at bay. You've got celestials on one side, but I know it's specifically in the Blood War, and it seems like, because I'm only about 3 episodes into the current one, maybe similar here too. It's like it's not even like the celestial side of things can be a little dicey in terms of decisions they make. So how do people find these characters when we begin in campaign 3? Like, let's just dive into a little bit of the overarching storyline for this new campaign.
Yeah. We wanted to give kind of a 0 session as well for some of our listeners, particularly ones that I think for subscribers, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, it's on
and
TikTok.
Wanted to throw them into like they're just meeting for the first time, but they're part of this kind of boot camp situation. So what would happen in this kind of scenario where they're preparing for a war that's involving deities and demons and stuff? And again, very goofy kind of motley crew of characters that somehow they might work together, maybe they don't, I don't know. And it's you got the typical drill sergeant that's really angry about something and you're not sure what, and needs to take it out, needs to have therapy in his life, but it's much shorter than you expect and has missing an eye. So it's like I like to have fun and play with the tropes, but kind of always do a little twist on it. That's the D&D way. And I really have enjoyed creating like NPCs and characters, different officers and privates that were just fun to throw funny names into, like private parts. I mean, that's just a funny name. You got to throw it in the D&D campaign, right?
Yeah, it's very major. It's very
exactly.
Slaughterhouse 5. Yeah. And then I guess speaking of the characters, that's one of the big thing for new listeners, especially. What are the what's the sort of the brief rundown of the characters that make up the cast of campaign 3 of Tales from the Stinky Dragon?
Oh boy, do we have a cast of characters, you could call it. So I feel like all of us as players, it's been the same group of players for every single campaign. And so I think everyone loves to do something different each time. I don't think anybody has played a very similar character from campaign to campaign. So my character is a bugbear artificer named Doug, who I love with all my heart. Very silly boy. But I'm focusing all of my stats on kind of like intelligence and wisdom, which, as anyone who's listened to our podcast know, that's a rarity for any of our characters. And then we have Gunther, who's a little croak folk guy, a little fighter, who also has the deepest voice possible, played by Chris Damaris. And then we have Natty Wonder, who is a warlock, correct, Micah? A warlock character, a drow, played by John Reisinger, who's just the Southern Belle, who's wonderful. And then Blaine Gibson, always coming with just his A game every single campaign. He's playing Tolv, which is a orc barbarian. And so it's just a very funny group of people who you probably would not expect to find together. But as with every campaign, I think the chemistry we develop over the course of it is just the most fun.
Nice. So it's very much in the Critical Role vein of like same cast, brand new set of characters every time, but you guys don't have a Liam where every character is sad boy A, sad boy B, sad boy C.
Not yet. Yeah, no.
Not yet. And I guess one more big future question here to kind of wrap things up on, and that is you've talked about it being an audio only actual play. And I know you've experimented a little like here and there with doing some live stuff. You had the live stream in January of this year. Now that you are part of this Beacon platform, are you thinking about expanding the podcast in the future in any way to possibly include more live video episodes or even like more puppet or animatic stuff? Now that we've seen, Critical Role's expanded with, of course, Legend of Vox Machina by 9 animated. We've seen MITS start to go from being a purely audio podcast to having that full in-person arc with Moon, not Moonstruck. Oh, too many actual plays rattling around my head, but with their second MITS campaign. So that's something you guys have considered of like maybe starting to do a little more video content now that you're on this very video-friendly platform?
I mean, we're not definitely close to doing anything in the future. Whether it be live streams or in-person one-shots or things of that nature, I think we're always going to be pursuing that kind of thing. I do feel like, though, the podcast itself really, I think, thrives in the audio-only format just because of all the post-production that Micah puts into it, the music, the sound design, everything like that. That's really hard to accomplish when you're seeing it in person, and the editing might be chopped up a little bit more. But also just, I think we really like to immerse our audience completely into the story. And when it's an audio-only format, you're not seeing us, and so you could really picture these characters in this world. But in terms of more video content, I think we're always open to doing more, whether it's, again, live streams or other recorded content.
Yeah, and as previously mentioned, the audio mixing on this is fantastic. This is also kind of the era of the big actual play that is audio only coming back. We've seen Worlds Beyond Number has been huge with that, and they also have pretty phenomenal audio mixing. You've got guys like NADPod out there that have been doing it for a long time. So it's exciting to see that there's options still for that purely audio experience, because it is very immersive and it's nice to see.
Definitely. But I also do think that, you mentioned the puppets, whether it's the puppets or our animations that we've been working on. I think we would love to do more of that. Obviously, Stinky Dragon Adventures, that short form puppet series that I mentioned before, I know we would love to do many more seasons of that and maybe get it in front of, some network or a bigger audience at some point in the future. I think that would be a big dream of ours. But yeah, anything like that we could expand the Stinky universe, we'd be very excited about.
I mean, clearly Beacon has the space. If you put it on Beacon, Liam, I will stop asking you the lore. Is it a Byron poem or an emo band questions every time I interview you? That's my deal to you, Liam, if you're watching this one. But yeah, before we go, I always like to ask, is there anything that you guys think the viewers should know that we haven't touched on yet? Is there anything that you would love to talk about that we just haven't quite hit?
We have other behind-the-scenes shows that you can check out if you become a Patreon, or even on Beacon. You can check out our behind-the-scenes show, Second Wind. But we do plenty of things that involve our audience and our crowd, and we want to do more of those all the time. We have like a behind-the-screen show where we talk about DMing and what it's like to build worlds and be a player and improv. We have things where we do gaming, streaming events. There's all kinds of things we do for our audience, and you can find all of that at stinkydragonpod.com.
You can join the Stinky universe. Oh, and as I've just been reminded, Moonward. It was called Moonward. I combined Starstruck Odyssey and Moonward into Moonstruck, which will be a fourth unreleased season of MITS.
I know, now they have to make that too, yeah.
But guys, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us. Like I said, you can find them, follow their Patreon. You can follow them on Beacon, of course. It's Tales from the Stinky Dragon. New episodes out weekly. Please check them out on your podcast platform of choice or on Beacon. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. And for viewers at home, feel free to do the liking, the subscribing, all the YouTube stuff. Stay safe out there, and we will see you with a new video tomorrow.
See ya.
Bye.